Chapter 8 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 8, Part 2. Living Targets. These are a few of the cases which authorities have themselves made public. But this does not mean that thousands of similar acts of brutality have not taken place, although nothing is said of them. One day, in the middle of a Berlin street, the son of an attendant at a synagogue was attacked by a Nazi troop in the presence of his father. The lad was held by the Nazis, and one of them fired his revolver twice through the lad's right calf and twice through his left calf. The lad has now been in hospital for 3 months, and it is probable that he will be lame for life. A case from the provinces. The following statement, which we have received, has been checked up by us in detail. It is typical of hundreds of similar reports which are in the possession of editors outside Germany, and also in the hands of many private individuals. Quote, "In the little town of Niederstetten in Württemberg State, a small Jewish community has lived for centuries. Its members are for the most part merchants, who, as might be expected, insofar as they take any interest in politics, belong to the parties of the right rather than to the socialists or communists. Friendly relations existed until quite recently between the Christian and the Jewish sections of the population. A week before Easter, a Nazi detachment arrived in the town early one morning and occupied the town hall, also taking control of the police. Then the houses of the Jews were searched for communist documents, naturally without any result. In spite of this, 10 Jews, all respected citizens, were taken to the town hall, and there one by one taken to a room. Each of them was then gagged, thrown across a chair, and beaten with steel rods until he was practically unconscious. Then the victims, who could hardly stand, were taken to the council chamber and made to stand up against the wall, the Wailing Wall, as the Nazis called it. After they had been forced to give the fascist salute, they were allowed to leave the town hall. Most of them, however, were so weak after the ill treatment they had received that they had to be carried home by their relatives. All the victims were ill for some weeks, and one of them has lost his speech. It should be mentioned that the non-Jewish population of the town, most of whom had voted Nationalist in the election of March 5th, were very indignant at what had taken place. An old peasant said, "Hitler certainly would not have wanted this to be done." The old man apparently did not have a wireless, or else he would have known that these German men have only carried out what the leading people in Germany have broadcast as their aim in thundering speeches every evening. End of quote. The following appeal, issued by the Action Committee for Fighting Judah in Neustadt, was published in the local paper dated May 18, 1933. Quote, "Our aim is to liberate Neustadt from Jews and servants of the Jews. We must lay this down once again in plain language in case the people who are affected by it have not yet understood it. If anyone still thinks that he can defend the Jews, in our eyes he is a scoundrel with whom we shall deal in the same way as we deal with the Jews." End of quote. In the Nazi barracks. K.W. of Berlin reports as follows on his experience in a Nazi barracks. Quote, "A 26-year-old Jew was brought in with me. He told me later that he had been arrested on his motorcycle, although he had never paid any attention to politics and has never voted. First, his hair was cut off with nail scissors, and then the auxiliary police had a dispute as to who was to beat him. The auxiliary policeman who had brought him in said, 'I need not have brought the Jew in at all if I'm not going to be allowed to beat him.' The others said, 'You're drunk, go and sleep it off.' Most of the auxiliary police smelt strongly of alcohol. After that, the Jew was beaten up like the others, with cowhide whips, steel rods, and rubber batons. Then a dagger was placed against his chest, and he was told, 'Now you are going to be stabbed to death.' He was actually only scratched, and then he was told that he would be stabbed to death early the following morning. At 5:45 I was brought to trial. As they could produce nothing against me, I was taken to the sleeping hall, where about 40 men were lying. I myself was only given a few kicks and blows with rubber batons. There was also what they called a murder cell. The 3 men who were in this cell had been beaten black from head to foot. At 7 o'clock in the morning the Nazi officer in charge arrived, and we were given breakfast, coffee, and dry bread. Then we were drilled in the courtyard, after we had been forced to say, 'Hail to our chancellor Adolf Hitler.' While we were being drilled we had to sing Deutschland über alles and other similar songs. Then we were asked whether we would defend the fatherland if there was a war against Poland. We replied that we would. After that, we were asked what we would do if we were set free, and whether we would join the Nazis, and to this we also replied in the affirmative." End of quote. Polish protests. We cite the following, which is one of many official announcements and protests made by foreign countries. Quote, "Berlin, March 30th. The Polish ambassador in Berlin has lodged a protest with the German government against the persecution of Polish Israelites by Hitler's bands. The ambassador mentioned, among other cases, the following, which had occurred in Berlin. On March 4th, Herr Israel Weiss was taken from his flat and dragged off to a garage, where he was so brutally treated that he lost consciousness. After that, he was taken to the police station, where he was kept until March 6th. While he was being assaulted, Hitler's followers took from him his passport and his ring, and he never recovered those. On March 6th, Herr A.L. Mittelmann was attacked and taken into a restaurant, where he was very severely injured. As a result of his treatment, he is quite unable to work. In Chemnitz and Plauen, Hitler's followers have perpetrated terrible brutalities against the Jews. All the Polish Israelites who were arrested in Chemnitz were taken under guard through the town, being made to wash out all the inscriptions which had been written on the walls during the last election. A Polish citizen, Adalbert Daphner, was given 50 lashes with a riding whip, being forced after every blow to say thank you. Terrible cruelties were carried out against a number of Israelites in the prison at Plauen." End of quote. United States complaints. A message from Berlin dated March 9th states that the American ambassador has lodged a protest against the ill treatment of American citizens. He cites a number of cases which have occurred in Berlin alone in the course of a few days. Quote, "In Berlin, many Jews, including some of American nationality, have been brutally treated. For example, an American citizen, Herr Max Schussler, who is the owner of a house and had secured the eviction from his house of a Nazi tenant, was visited by Nazis one night. In order to gain entry to his flat, they represented themselves to be police. Then they demanded that Herr Schussler should sign a declaration allowing the return of his National Socialist tenant." End of quote. Official statement from Czechoslovakia. The official press bureau announces under date of April 2nd, quote, "In the hospital at Warnsdorf, 4 refugees from Germany who have been brutally treated are now lying. Last night at 1 o'clock they were taken from a place in Saxony, which is now a concentration camp, to another village not far from Warnsdorf, being accompanied by 12 Nazis. They were 4 Jews, one of whom is an Austrian citizen, 2 being Poles, and the 4th having no nationality. 100 yards from the frontier near Warnsdorf, the 4 men were taken out of the lorry and beaten up until they were covered with blood, and when they ran towards the frontier of Czechoslovakia, shots were fired after them. All 4 are seriously injured. One of them, in addition to other wounds, has a serious fracture of the skull and is unconscious. It must be noted that 2 of them had been settled in Leipzig for 25 years, where they were in business, and the other 2 had been 12 years in Dresden. It is announced from Germany that the refugees had refused to leave Germany, and had conducted themselves in an offensive manner to the guards who were accompanying them." End of quote. At the frontier. The following message comes from Prague. Quote, "The Berlin-Athens Express, which every day brings several hundred people to Prague, arrived there an hour late on April 1st, and with only 3 passengers. The passengers made depositions which they signed before a notary regarding what had happened in Dresden. At the station in Dresden, a cordon of Nazis had been drawn up on both sides of the train, and another detachment came through the compartments giving the order, 'Jews out of the train.' All Jewish passengers, including foreigners, were forced to leave the train. After this, the passports of the other passengers on the train were examined, and they were also forced to get out. They were forced to line up on the platform, and then they were ordered to march. The column of passengers, guarded by Nazis, went off towards the exit from the station. After this, nothing more has been heard of them. They included many women and children." End of quote. Another report runs as follows. Quote, "The National Socialists even come onto Czechoslovakian territory and promise a reward for any refugees who can be brought onto German territory under any pretext. The reward promised for an ordinary refugee is 100 crowns. For a Jewish refugee, however, the amount is 200 crowns. These facts have been certified by the Czechoslovakian authorities." End of quote. The following laconic announcement from Warsaw throws further light on the position of refugees. Quote, "Warsaw, March 15th. 48 Jewish families from Germany, consisting in all of 150 persons, have crossed the frontier of East Prussia and taken refuge in Poland. There were terrible scenes at the frontier, the refugees being horribly ill-treated by the German frontier guards. They were beaten and kicked, and everything they had with them was taken from them by the guards." End of quote. The Chief Rabbi of France issues a statement. In connection with the denials issued by the German authorities, the Chief Rabbi of France has issued the following statement in connection with the anti-Semitic excesses in Germany. Quote, "I am unfortunately compelled to say that the statements regarding atrocities are absolutely correct. We have evidence that cannot be disputed and also photographic documents. Do not think that we believe what we are told by refugees without further examination. We have ways of checking up on their statements. We are in possession of documents which have come to us from an absolutely reliable source, which I am not able to name. I can, however, say that some of these documents have an official character and have been prepared by foreign governments. The incidents in question are not cases of simple abuse, but cruel persecutions which have created victims and martyrs. If we are compelled to publish these documents, we shall do so. The conscience of the world," the Chief Rabbi continues, "is deeply troubled and is horrified at the revival of barbarism which the anti-Semitism of the Nazis represents. In the name of humanity and civilization, the whole world protests with us. It fears that the restoration of world peace will be endangered through these new attacks of brutal force against right." End of quote. The correspondent of the English Manchester Guardian has made an extremely detailed and objective report published April 8, 1933, which is certainly not colored either by love or by hatred of National Socialism, but only by a human horror of brutality. Quote, "The samples of outrages committed by brown shirts since the elections make it more evident than ever that the terror has been much worse than was at first believed. The British, French, and American press, so far from exaggerating it, as the German press complains, has understated the truth, although this is natural enough, seeing that only a small fraction of the truth is accessible. The terror seems to have been worst of all, worse even than in Berlin, in Kassel, in Silesia, where Heines, who was imprisoned on a charge of manslaughter and released by an amnesty, is in charge of the brown shirts, in Worms, and in many villages. A precise account of what has happened in the villages of Oberhessen alone during the last 4 weeks would make a terrible story, but it is impossible to establish more than a few cases, enquiry being made difficult by the general fear not only of reprisals but also of imprisonment. A few days ago a man was sentenced to a year's imprisonment for spreading the false rumor that a Jew had been hanged by the brown shirts. The rumor, as a matter of fact, was true. The Jew, a certain Mr. Blank, was beaten by brown shirts and hanged by his feet so that his head was suspended off the ground. When the brown shirts had finished with him, he was dead. Any German who dare say a true word about the terror in his own country runs the risk of a fearful beating, or long imprisonment, or even death, and no one can reasonably be expected to run such a risk. But as one of the victims of the terror said to your correspondent today, it is impossible to remain silent even under threats. There is no reason why opinion in England and the United States should be hoodwinked, and it is necessary to point out that letters or statements by German Jewish or Republican organizations or societies saying that the terror has been exaggerated are products of fear and intimidation, and are therefore altogether unworthy of credence. Thousands upon thousands of Germans have only one wish, to get out of the country. But the frontiers are being closed by the new passport regulations, and escape is impossible except at great risk. Thus, all Germany is being converted into a huge prison." End of quote. Einstein's appeal. We will end this section with the appeal issued by Professor Einstein after he had been driven out of Germany. Professor Einstein arrived at Havre on March 27th on the steamer Belgenland. He was met by a delegation of the International League Against Anti-Semitism and gave the following statement written by his own hand. Quote, "The actual facts of brutal force and oppression against every free-minded person, and against the Jews, the facts of what has taken place and is still taking place in Germany, have fortunately aroused the conscience of every country which remains true to the ideals of humanity and political freedom. All friends of our civilization, which is so seriously menaced, should concentrate all their efforts in order to rid the world of this psychological disease." End of quote. The boycott. A defensive movement. From its early days, National Socialism has made use of the method of representing itself as attacked, persecuted, and menaced. The political terror which has been organized by Hitler has always worked hand in hand with organized lies. The boycott against Jewish business concerns and the special acts against German Jews, of which we will speak later, give the best examples of the combined use of these methods. The National Socialists might have said, "It is in accord with our program and with the demands which we have been making for many years that the Jews in Germany should be completely wiped out." But what did the Nazis actually do by way of justifying their boycott of Jewish shops? They cried out, "We have been attacked. The Jews are trying to destroy us. What we are doing is in self-defense." This organized boycott was therefore called a defensive movement. The boycott manifesto, which was posted up everywhere, runs as follows, quote, "Men and women of the German nation, the people who are guilty of this crime, this despicable atrocity campaign, are the Jews in Germany. They have called to their fellows abroad to fight against the German people. It is they who have issued lying statements and abuse. For that reason the leaders of the German movement of liberation have decided, by way of defense against this criminal campaign, to impose a boycott on all Jewish businesses, shops, etc., as from 10 o'clock in the morning of April 1st, 1933. We call on you, German men and women, to make this boycott effective. Do not buy from Jewish businesses and shops. Do not go to Jewish lawyers. Have nothing to do with Jewish doctors. Show the Jews that they cannot go unpunished if they humiliate and dishonor Germany. Anyone who opposes this manifesto thereby proves that he is on the side of the enemies of Germany." End of quote. On March 28th, the national leaders of the National Socialist Party published a manifesto to all party organizations in which the German Jews are accused of having started the atrocity campaign against the national government of Germany. The 11 points of the program. On the same day, the famous 11 points for carrying through the boycott were published. We give them verbatim below. 1. In each local group and section of the National Socialist Party, action committees must be formed at once for the practical and systematic carrying out of the boycott of Jewish shops, Jewish goods, Jewish doctors, and Jewish lawyers. The action committees are responsible for seeing that the boycott does not harm any innocent person, but that it hits all the harder all those who are guilty. 2. The action committees are responsible for protecting all foreigners without regard to their religion or race. The boycott is a purely defensive measure, and it is exclusively directed against German Jews. 3. The action committees must immediately popularize the boycott by propaganda and explanatory statements. The principle of the boycott is that no German should buy from any Jew or be served by any Jew or his assistants. The boycott must be general. It must be carried out by the whole people and must hit Judah in its most sensitive spot. 4. In cases of doubt, the boycott of businesses must be postponed pending a decision from the Central Committee in Munich. 5. The action committees must closely watch the newspapers from the standpoint of how far they take part in the Enlightenment campaign of the German people against the atrocity campaign of the Jews. If the newspapers do not do this, or only do it to a limited extent, steps must be taken to see that they are immediately prevented from reaching any house in which Germans live. No German man and no German business must give them advertisements. They must be given to understand that they incur only public contempt and that they are written for people of Jewish race but not for Germans. 6. The action committees must carry into the factories their propaganda of enlightenment as to the consequences to German labor of the Jewish atrocity campaign, and they must explain to the workers that the national boycott was necessary as a protective measure on behalf of German labor. 7. The action committees must carry their activities into the smallest villages in order to strike particularly at the Jewish traders in the countryside. 8. The boycott must not be introduced gradually, but at a single blow. All preparatory measures must therefore be taken immediately with this in view. Instructions must be given to the storm troops to post pickets to warn the population against entering Jewish shops from the moment when the boycott begins. This will be April 1st punctually at 10 o'clock in the morning. It will be carried on until instructions are received from the party leadership. 9. The action committees must immediately popularize at thousands of mass meetings, which must reach even the smallest village, the demand that Jews shall only be admitted to every profession in proportion to the number of Jews in the community. In order to make this action more effective, The demand should at first be restricted to 3 sections. A. Students in the intermediate schools and universities. B. The medical profession. C. The legal profession. 10. The action committees are furthermore charged to see that every German who has any connection whatever with people in other countries should make use of this, in letters, telegrams, and telephonic communications, to spread the truth that peace and order reign in Germany, that the German people has no more ardent wish than to continue its work in peace and to live in peace with the rest of the world, and that its fight against the Jewish atrocity campaign is purely defensive. 11. The action committees are responsible for seeing that the whole fight is carried out absolutely peacefully and with the strictest discipline. Henceforth no Jew must have even a hair of his head harmed. We must finish with this atrocity campaign purely through the effectiveness of the measures outlined above. This manifesto was accompanied by a long-winded explanation, each word of which was evidence of a bad conscience. The explanation concluded with the words, "National Socialists, on Saturday at 10 o'clock the Jews will know who it is that they are fighting." The lords of the Third Empire appointed to take charge of this defensive action a man named Julius Streicher, the editor of a newspaper called Der Stürmer. The outside world will not know what sort of paper this is, although from time to time its circulation runs into hundreds of thousands. For his services in editing this, Herr Streicher has been appointed commissioner in charge of the boycott movement. Herr Streicher had hardly taken up his post when he gave an interview to the press at a conference of national journalists on March 30th. In the course of this interview he said, quote, "I shall not hesitate to prohibit by force the holding of divine service by the German Jews, or to prevent them from gaining entry to the synagogues by the use of armed storm troops. The stone has now begun to roll. Whether the atrocity propaganda ceases or not makes no difference. This foreign propaganda against Hitler has given us the opportunity which we welcome, and the action will be carried through. It would be a complete illusion to imagine that the Nazis will allow themselves to be held back." End of quote. He, Streicher, was completely satisfied with the way things had developed. His only care in the past week had been to see that the war of destruction against the Jews did not weaken. Quote, "Had this happened, this is my firm conviction, the national revolution would have collapsed owing to its own weakness. This danger has now finally been averted, and the German people can trust in me to carry out the whole of the necessary work in connection with the Jews." End of quote. Preparations for the boycott. Incitements to Jew-baiting were systematically developed during the last few days before the boycott. An example of this was the speech given by the newly appointed chief of police in Frankfurt, reported in the Frankfurter Volksblatt of March 30th. Quote, "No Nazi will have anything to do with a Jew, because he knows that the Jew is of inferior race, and I am no longer going to permit animals born on German soil to be killed by the sadistic Asiatic methods of slaughter used by the Jews. If the Jew cannot eat our meat, then let him eat potatoes and turnips as you did in the hungry winters of the war. Germany is awake. You Jews, you have no need to tremble. We shall remain legal, so legal that perhaps legality will be uncomfortable for you, and then you can go to Palestine and fleece each other." End of quote. The instructions from the Nazi leaders issued in a steady stream. Action committees were set up everywhere, and they were given the task of ascertaining which shops, stores, lawyers' offices, etc. were in the hands of Jews. The Central Committee for the Boycott of Jewish Concerns laid down the following principles for action. Quote, "The action committees must hand over to the storm troops the list of shops which have been ascertained to be Jewish, in order that these may be picketed from 10 o'clock on the morning of Saturday, April 1st, 1933. The pickets are charged with informing the public that the shops at which they are posted are Jewish. They are forbidden to take any physical measures of restraint. They are also forbidden to close the shop. In order to make it clear which shops are Jewish, posters or placards with yellow spots on a black ground must be posted at the entrance doors. The Jewish shops which are boycotted must not dismiss their non-Jewish employees and workers or give them notice. The action committees, in agreement with the political leaders of the district, must organize mass demonstrations and processions in all areas on Friday evening. On the Saturday morning at 10 o'clock at latest, the posters of the boycott proclamation must be put up on all advertising spaces. At the same time, lorries, or better still furniture vans, must be driven through the streets with posters bearing the following words in the order given. In defense against the Jewish atrocity and boycott campaign. Boycott all Jewish shops. Don't buy from Jewish stores. Don't go to Jewish lawyers. Avoid Jewish doctors. The Jews are our bane. The committees must organize collections in the German shops to finance this movement of defense." End of quote. During the days preceding April 1st, the following announcement was posted on all advertisement spaces throughout Germany. Quote, "The Jews have time to reflect until Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. Then the fight begins. The Jews of the whole world are trying to destroy Germany. German people, defend yourselves. Don't buy from the Jews." End of quote. Several of the government departments also issued instructions as to the measures which were to be taken in connection with the boycott. All sections of the Nazi organization also issued detailed instructions. There was no party official who failed to take the opportunity to make himself important by issuing an instruction of some kind. Treatment of judges. An eyewitness has given us the following report. Quote, "On Friday, March 31st, an extraordinary scene took place in front of the High Court in Cologne. Nazi lads forced their way into the court buildings and dragged out the Jewish lawyers and judges. Then these were put into a refuse cart and made the laughingstock of the crowd. Many of the lawyers and judges were still wearing their robes. The police looked on without interfering. The cart was then taken to the main police station, which is a considerable distance from the court. The official report, which is an absolute lie, was as follows. In Cologne, members of the Nazi storm troop, in conjunction with the police, arrested a number of Jewish judges and lawyers for their personal safety as a large crowd had collected in front of the law courts." End of quote. The boycott had a limit, namely at the point when it endangered profit. In effect, all these measures only hurt the Jewish middle class and working class, but not the big Jewish capitalists. And when it was a question of trade with foreigners, all prejudice and race hatred had to fall into the background, and the Jews were not treated as sub-men or world pests, but only as extremely welcome paying guests. Here is a report published in the Frankfurter Zeitung. Quote, "Wiesbaden, May 31st. Up to the present this year, the number of visitors has fallen below expectations. The number of foreign visitors during the first week of May, which is always the height of the season for Wiesbaden, was 1,744, and in the festival week following it rose only to 1,808, falling again to 1,760 in the third week. The total number of visitors up to the middle of May has only been 27,000. It is therefore in the interests of this health resort that the local magistrates, the directors of the courthouse, and the national district leaders should make it known to everyone concerned, both in the country and abroad, that the mineral springs of Wiesbaden are as before available without hindrance to all visitors from all countries, and that peace and order have never been disturbed in this town. The authorities of Wiesbaden should feel their responsibility both to the population and also to foreign visitors, and should guarantee to all who are either permanently in Wiesbaden or make a temporary stay there, without regard to their religion or political outlook, a secure and pleasant visit." End of quote. End of Chapter 8, Part 2. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Chapter 8 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 8, Part 3. Laws of Exception. The open boycott ended on April 1st, although the National Socialist press, the official leaders of the party, as well as their spokesman, had assured the whole organization that this historic Saturday must be regarded as merely a test preparatory to a whole series of other measures, which would be carried out unless the opinion of the world, which at the moment was hostile, underwent a complete change. Opinion in other countries certainly changed radically, but in a direction unfavorable to the Third Empire. The government in Germany was quick to notice this. In fact, they noted it even before the boycott, and they realized that this open demonstration against the Jews was bad business. The National Socialists have principles, but they've always been prepared to sell them. The retreat. In the course of the week before the boycott, even Herr Streicher, evidently under instructions from the government, stated that it would not be necessary to resume the boycott, and the Minister for Propaganda and National Enlightenment told the representatives of the foreign press on March 31st, quote, that the government had decided provisionally to restrict the boycott against the Jews to Saturday, April 1st, when it would operate from 10 o'clock in the morning till 8 in the evening. After that, no further action would be taken until Wednesday. If the international press had by then stopped its agitation against Germany, no further action would be taken. But if this were not the case, a boycott would be started at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, and this boycott would drive the Jews of Germany into absolute ruin. The instructions that 2 months' wages and salaries of employees of Jewish firms must be paid in advance from April 1st is cancelled. End of quote. The last sentence of this announcement shows that under the pressure of events, the National Socialists had been forced to repeal their own decrees. It had originally been decided that all owners of Jewish shops must pay all their Christian employees 2 months' salary in advance. The consequence of this was a run on the banks which might have led to a catastrophe if this decree had not been withdrawn at the earliest possible moment. The silent boycott. The public boycott was a demonstration, and as a demonstration it failed and was not resumed. On the other hand, the silent boycott was continued, a boycott which cost nothing and hit not so much the rich and powerful Jewish firms as the tens of thousands of Jewish employees, doctors, lawyers, teachers, officials, university professors, etc. Hundreds of thousands of Jews have been deprived of their living, but this has given hundreds of thousands of places for Nazi hangers-on. Jewish lawyers not allowed to practice. In Berlin, at first out of 1,200 Jewish lawyers, only 35 were permitted to practice, and the number allowed to continue their practice in Cologne was only 4. All Jewish judges have been given leave of absence. The commissioner of the Prussian Ministry of Justice issued the following instructions on March 31st. Quote, the irritation of the people at the presumptuous attitude of Jewish lawyers and doctors has reached such a height that it is necessary to take into account the possibility that the people may take the law into their own hands, especially during the period of the defense campaign of the German people against the Jewish atrocity propaganda. This would endanger the authority of the administration of justice. I therefore request you to suggest to all Jewish judges now in office that they should at once apply for leave of absence, and this should immediately be granted to them. Please arrange with the Lawyers Association or other local organizations of the legal profession that from 10 o'clock tomorrow morning the number of Jewish lawyers permitted to practice is fixed in a proportion which is the same as that of the Jewish population to the rest of the population. It is unnecessary to point out that Jewish lawyers should not be employed as junior counsel, nor should they be allowed to take doc briefs or be appointed receivers in bankruptcy or trustees. All engagements of Jewish lawyers in connection with official cases must immediately be withdrawn. The executives of associations of lawyers must be induced to resign. If the provincial and local leaders of the National Socialists express the desire to supervise the maintenance of security and order within the court building by sending armed pickets to these places, their wishes should be complied with. End of quote. Similar instructions were issued against Jewish doctors. In the first place, they were excluded from health insurance practice, which, of course, covered the great majority of all cases. The teachers and lecturers in Prussian educational institutions were required by the Minister of Culture, Rust, to fill out a questionnaire as to their racial origin. The civil service. As for government officials, the following decree was published in the beginning of April. Quote, anyone of non-Aryan descent, particularly if their parents or grandparents were Jewish, is to be regarded as non-Aryan. One parent or one grandparent who is non-Aryan is sufficient. This is particularly to be assumed when one parent or grandparent has been a member of the Jewish religious community. Furthermore, every official who has joined the service since August 1, 1914, must prove that he is of Aryan descent, or that he fought at the front, or that his son or father fell in the World War. Birth certificates and marriage certificates of parents, in addition to military papers, must be sent in. If the Aryan descent of an official is doubtful, a decision must be made by the Office of Experts for Racial Investigation attached to the Ministry of the Interior. In deciding whether the provisions of Section 4, Paragraph 1 apply, the whole political activity of the official concerned particularly since November 9, 1918, must be taken into account. Every official is under an obligation to inform his superior authorities to what political party he has hitherto belonged and what his political activities have been. The Reichsbanner, the Republican Richterbund, and the League for the Rights of Man are to be considered political parties within the meaning of this paragraph. This decree finally and definitely puts an end to the scandal of the November system, which aims at the destruction of the honest professional government servant by the introduction of party officials and office seekers. The consequences of this criminal policy have been the innumerable scandals of corruption, in which the people concerned were always representatives of the parties which, in November 1918, by treason and cowardice had put themselves at the head of a clean and untarnished state. It is well known, and does not require to be proved here in detail, that the most prominent supporters of the November Republic had been involved in the worst of these affairs. That period is now gone forever, and the new Germany will once more be administered by really efficient officials, as the world knows it was before the war." End of quote. The special importance of this decree is that subsequently almost all categories of university-trained people, doctors, lawyers, teachers in high schools, etc., and also bank officials and commercial employees were put through a sieve in accordance with the principles laid down in this decree. The attack on Jewish doctors. The following manifesto was published in the Medical Journal of Greater Berlin, dated May 20th, 1933. The writer, a certain Dr. Rupin, is not just a nobody. He is commissioner of the Provincial Medical Association of the provinces of Brandenburg and Grenzmark. The article is headed, "Away with Jewish Doctors." The text is as follows, quote, "The complete removal of Jews from all academic professions is necessary. Members of the free academic professions, particularly doctors, come into personal contact with very wide circles of the population, and occupy a position of confidence in relation to their patients, which gives them influence over the outlook of the people with whom they are in contact. The provincial executive of the doctors of Brandenburg therefore considers it unthinkable that in our national state a Jew should have the possibility of spreading the poison of Jewish thought in this way. Undoubtedly, the earlier ideal conception of professional duty has given way in wide circles of the profession to the Jewish commercial outlook, and this is due to the overloading of the profession with Jews. This commercial attitude must be driven out of the medical profession, and we must make its reintroduction impossible. Insofar as corruption has penetrated the profession, it must be rooted out by the most decisive measures. We, German doctors, therefore demand the exclusion of all Jews from the possibility of giving medical treatment to our German people, because the Jew is the incarnation of lies and deceit. Furthermore, we demand legislation to punish with imprisonment and immediate removal from the profession the offenses and crimes which are associated with the positions of confidence filled by the profession. We doctors ask all national professional organizations in Germany to support our demand." End of quote. By way of supplement to the above, we give the following decree of Commissioner Dr. Wagner, who is in control of the German medical associations. Quote, "In pursuance of the boycott against the Jews, the Berlin Health Department, by agreement with the mayor, instructed its sections not to meet any claims from its members where Jewish doctors have been called in to treat cases on or after April 1st. Where a Jewish doctor had previously been called in, it is suggested that members should consider whether to continue to make use of him. The Health Insurance Institute hopes that a sense of national duty will prevent the members from making use of Jewish chemists, dispensaries, opticians, or dentists." End of quote. Dismissal of Jewish teachers. We can give only a few examples of the many similar instructions which have been issued in connection with the various professions. The future position of Jewish teachers in Germany is indicated by a letter issued by one of the most prominent of the Nazi leaders, Dr. Loppelmann, a member of the Prussian Diet. Quote, "We call your attention to the fact that it is intolerable that Jewish teachers should still fill posts in Prussian educational institutions, while German soldiers who fought at the front have to wander around as unpaid auxiliary teachers in their own fatherland. Furthermore, we consider it an impossible situation that any regard should be paid to the exaggerated claims of male and female Jewish scholars. On behalf of the National Socialist Parliamentary Fraction in Prussia, we expect you to take the following measures. 1. All Jewish teachers, that is, teachers of Jewish descent, must immediately be dismissed or sent on leave from all Prussian educational institutions. 2. In the case of male and female scholars who are Jews, the proportionate clause must be applied so that the percentage of pupils of Jewish origin in any institution must correspond with the proportion of Jews to the whole German population, that is to say, only 1% of the students at any institution may be Jews or of Jewish descent." End of quote. In accordance with this circular, almost all Jewish teachers employed in the public educational system were immediately granted leave. An instruction issued by the chief official of Brandenburg and Berlin extended these measures also to Jewish private teachers. A cabinet meeting on April 25th passed an act, quote, "against the excessive number of students of foreign race in German schools and universities." End of quote. The same principles were applied to the staffs of universities. In an earlier chapter, some of the best-known Jewish lecturers who have been dismissed are mentioned. Removal of Jewish editors and journalists. The Neue Freie Presse of April 13, 1933 reports, quote, "In the extraordinary general meeting of the members of the Berlin District Organization of the National Union of the German Press, it was unanimously decided to nominate Dr. Dietrich at the General Delegate Meeting for the presidency of the Union. After the general meeting of the Berlin Organization, the new committee met and adopted unanimously a motion that in future no Jewish or Marxist editors were to be admitted to membership. A further motion for the General Delegate Meeting was also adopted unanimously, demanding that Jewish and Marxist editors not be permitted to enter or belong to the National Union of the German Press." End of quote. Almost all Jewish editors of German papers have been dismissed, and contributions from independent journalists of Jewish faith or Jewish origin are not accepted. It must be noted that in this connection even Jewish newspaper proprietors have achieved inglorious distinction. For example, Gutermann, the Jewish proprietor of the Neue Badische Landeszeitung in Mannheim, dismissed all his Jewish editorial staff and employees as early as March 1st. Debarred from lists of assessors and juries. The silent boycott of the Jews continues in every sphere. They are being banished from all public life. The Neue Freie Presse of April 12th reports the exclusion of Jews from the lists of assessors, jurymen, and arbitrators. Quote, "The government has decided to shorten the current period of office of all assessors and jurymen to June 30th, at which date the period of office of commercial arbitrators will also be brought to a close. The new lists of assessors and jurymen will be differently constituted in the future. As in present circumstances, the municipal authorities will naturally send people of a different outlook to participate in the electoral colleges. There will no longer be any communist assessors and jurymen. The number of Social Democrats nominated will be considerably smaller than hitherto, and it is probable that no Jews will be elected. The appointment of the new commercial arbitrators will also be on the same lines. The decree just issued provides that until new elections of assessors and jurymen are held, judges need not adhere to the existing rules for bringing in lay assistants. For example, they may pass over certain names on the lists." End of quote. Jews as outcasts in sport. Even in sport, every Jew is an outcast. Although even in America colored boxers are allowed to take part in championship fights, German boxers of Jewish faith or origin are no longer allowed to appear in the boxing ring in Germany. The holder of the middleweight championship in Germany, Erich Seelig, was prevented from defending his title in Germany. He was, however, able to show his form in France. Daniel Pren, who is far and away the best tennis player in Germany, can no longer be selected to represent Germany in international matches. We await with interest the steps which are to be taken against Helena Meyer, the champion woman fencer. Although probably no one looks more pure-blooded and Nordic than she does, she is the daughter of a Jewish doctor in Offenbach. We quote the following as a good example of many similar announcements. It was printed in the Neue Freie Presse of April 28, 1933. Quote, "The German Swimming Association issues the following statement. The German Swimming Association has adopted the Aryan Clause. In what form the membership of Jews in all sports associations, and therefore in the Swimming Association, will be regulated, and whether the Aryan Clause will be incorporated in the statutes of the association, will be determined in accordance with instructions issued by the government. Meanwhile, I order that Jews shall be removed from all leading positions in the association and put into the background, and they must not appear as representatives in displays or take part in sports meetings. George Hacks." The German Swimming Association is at present affiliated to the International Swimming Association, and the Aryan Clause conflicts with the statutes of the latter body, which prescribe equality of rights for everyone. The president of the International Swimming Association is, however, Binner, who was removed from the executive of the German Association because of his international outlook. Pending the final decision of the Government Commissioner of Sport, the regulations relating to official posts will be applied to Jewish members of the DSB Union. This means that only those Jews, by race, not religion, who enjoy protection under the civil service law will be allowed to take part in sports meetings." End of quote. Malicious rumors. But when business questions come in this connection also loyalty to principle takes second place. The government-controlled 12 Uhr Mittagsblatt of April 19, 1933, under the heading "Malicious Rumors," gives an assurance that the race question will not be raised at the 11th Olympiad, which is to take place in Berlin in 1936. Quote, "The foreign boycott propaganda against Germany has even penetrated sport. Many foreign papers have repeatedly stated during the last few weeks that efforts are being made, especially in the United States, to transfer to another country the Olympic Games which have been arranged for Berlin in 1936, on the alleged grounds that measures will be taken in Germany to prevent Jewish sportsmen from taking part in international competitions." In reply to an official enquiry, Avery Brundage, chairman of the American Olympic Committee, stated that the International Olympic Committee had the right to select where the Olympiad would be held. The committee, which is to meet in Vienna in June, would undoubtedly consider the question. His personal opinion was that the Olympic Games should not be held in a country where the fundamental Olympic principle of the equality of all races was being violated. In connection with the premature declaration made by this leading American sportsman, it must be stated that no measures have been or will be taken in Germany which make participation in international sporting events dependent on the question of race. The world can be confident that every individual who is sent to Berlin to represent his country in the Olympic Games will be received and treated as a guest, irrespective of his race or nationality. End of quote. Passports. Special regulations are also in force for Jewish holders of passports. The Breslau chief of police has issued instructions, quote, "The German citizens of Jewish faith, or formerly of Jewish faith, who are in possession of passports must present these in person at the police headquarters of the area in which they live, not later than April 3, 1933. The passports will be returned after they have been altered so as to make them valid only for internal traveling in Germany." End of quote. Special hours for the baths. There is hardly any possible regulation calculated to bring Jewish citizens into disrepute of which some person in authority or some administrative body has not thought. The town of Speyer in the Palatinate will live in the history of these times for its unique inventive powers. It has the glory of being the first German municipal authority to issue a regulation, quote, "that in the interests of public order, Jews may only use the municipal baths at certain hours of the day." End of quote. Other German municipal authorities were quick to follow this example. The Frankfurter Zeitung of May 24, 1933 reports, quote, "At the Tübingen council meeting on May 15th, it was moved by a National Socialist that Jews and persons of foreign race be excluded from the use of the free municipal baths. The motion was adopted with only 3 voting against it." End of quote. Shortly afterwards, the Upper Silesian newspapers published similar regulations. Dismissal of Jewish employees. It would be a mistake to think that German Jews were only thrown out of the professions. A good deal is said, and rightly so, about the outlawry of Jewish professors, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and artists, but unfortunately not so much attention is paid to the treatment of Jewish employees, small traders, and workers. But the main part of the Jewish population is covered by these categories, and the economic position of these Jews is just as difficult as that of the non-Jewish lower middle class and working class. The Nazi factory cell organizations have been most assiduous in depriving the Jewish clerks, small traders, and workers of their livelihood. A Berlin message of March 31st runs, quote, "On the instructions of the National Socialist Party executive, the Factory Cell Organization instructs National Socialist Factory Cell committees, together with the workers' organizations, to visit the Jewish shops and demand 2 months' payment in advance for Christian workers and employees. The demand should also be made that all Jewish employees be dismissed. Anyone refusing to comply with these demands must be immediately reported to the party leadership, which will take the necessary steps. Punctually at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, all employees and workers in Jewish shops must leave work and take part in warning off customers. Newspapers and vital industries are excepted, but in any case all Jewish employees must be dismissed. In the Ulstein publishing house, the whole of the responsible editorial staff of Jewish race has been granted leave of absence." End of quote. The Frankfurter Zeitung of May 28, 1933 states, quote, "It is reported in the Postnecker Handlerblatt, the official journal of the Association of German Merchants, Showmen, and Commercial Travelers, whose headquarters are at Dresden, that at a provincial conference of the Union of Traders, the question was raised whether Jewish merchants and traders would be allowed access to the markets in future. The president of the provincial organization put forth the view that the Jews must be completely rooted out." End of quote. Business is business, even for anti-Semites. The Völkischer Beobachter of April 2nd proclaims the spontaneous rise of prices on the stock exchange, now rid of Jews, as the most obvious result of the boycott movement. We know why such a point is made of this. It is to show that the fight is not against the existing system, not against capitalism, and not even against the excesses of capitalism, but that it is a competitive fight of the national profiteers against the Jewish profiteers. The members of the stock exchange can do business even on a stock exchange now rid of Jews. The fight is not against capitalism, not against private property, but against the small man, against the Aryan workers and middle class who are being hoaxed, against the Jewish employees and small traders who are being ruined, to the delight of the capitalists of Aryan and Jewish blood. The Aryan principles are regulated everywhere by the size of a man's purse. In a statement printed in the Berliner Tageblatt of March 31, 1933, Herr Oskar Wassermann, a director of the Deutsche Bank und Diskonto-Gesellschaft, correctly stated that he had not suffered the least inconvenience, and that the change of things had not made any noticeable difference so far as he was concerned, even from a social standpoint. The other Jewish capitalists may equally congratulate themselves. The National Socialist government is doing its utmost for their material well-being. It has issued reproofs to those in its lower organizations who thought that the basis of anti-Semitism was the National Socialist hostility to capitalism. It protects, if not the Jews, at least Jewish capital, business first. Capitalism, whether Aryan or represented by Jews, is not to fall a victim to the spiritual revival which the national revolution has brought to boiling point. The Frankfurter Zeitung and the Völkischer Beobachter of March 27th published the following letter addressed by the Commissioner for Trade, Dr. Wagner, to the President of the National Socialist Party Office for Municipal Politics, Mayor Führer of Munich. Quote, "I have recently received from a number of business firms copies of circulars issued by various local authorities to a large number of manufacturers and other business concerns, with a view to ascertaining whether the concerns can be regarded as German undertakings. The questions put in the circulars are intended to discover to what extent the capital of the firm concerned is German, to what extent non-Aryan and non-German principles are connected with it, and so forth. While I am of course completely in agreement with the view that the municipalities particularly should only obtain their requirements from German firms, I nevertheless consider it necessary that a stop should be put to the measures which have been taken. The whole complex of questions raised in these circulars is not so simple that decisions can be made by a mere yes or no or on the basis of figures. It is rather the government's task to see that every undertaking in Germany, no matter where its capital comes from or who controls it, finds its place in the German economic system, and that the management of each undertaking is in future conducted exclusively from a German economic standpoint. In carrying through this necessary task, the government can, however, only be hindered if, through the action of certain authorities, a situation is created which reacts unfavorably on economic life. Our aim cannot be to ruin existing economic undertakings in Germany, even if they are worked with foreign capital and have hitherto been directed to some extent by foreign individuals, but rather to compel them to act in a German way and in conformity with the great principle laid down by our leader, the common good before private interests. I must therefore request you to use your influence as the leader of the Department of Municipal Politics to prevent further circulars of this type being issued in future, and to explain that such measures will cause a dislocation in the whole of the country's economic life which, with the best will in the world, we do not want at the present time." With the best will in the world. They do not want any capitalist to suffer loss in this national revolution. We knew this long ago. The people who still swear by the socialist Adolf Hitler and expect him to perform the miracle of securing for the peasants higher prices and at the same time lower prices for the consumer, higher wages for the workers, and at the same time greater profits for the employers, higher salaries for civil servants together with economies to the state. These misled and incited miracle believers will before long be roused from their hypnotized state by the undeniable and inexorable fact that in the Third Empire no one gains anything but the capitalists, whether they are of Jewish or non-Jewish faith. They will learn, from what they still have to experience in the Third Empire, that the whole campaign against the Jews has only served to distract them from the struggle against the people who are really responsible for their conditions. The Aryan Clause and race officials. We have seen that the anti-Semitism of the new Germany has a biological basis, that it is racial anti-Semitism. This biological anti-Semitism dates back to the anti-Semitic campaign led by the court chaplain Stocker, which derived its ideology, that is, its pseudo-scientific justification, from Eugen Dühring's The Jewish Question as a Question of Racial Character. Race science, which used to be a hobby horse of freak writers and was never taken seriously, has now in the new Germany been declared as an official science, which means that it is now a lucrative profession. The Jews as a race. It is true that in spite of all its efforts, this science has not yet succeeded in proving that the Germans are a race. On the contrary, it is evident that the Germans are a mixed people and are very far from having any right to call themselves Nordic. But these curious research workers have not yet even succeeded in proving that the Jews are really a race. We will come to their aid. There is something in the talk of a Jewish race. But in this case, too, it is necessary to stand things on their head in order to examine the matter, which is extremely complex. That is to say, we must treat race not as an original factor, but as an artificial product, not as the beginning, but as the result of a process of evolution. To attempt to trace back the Jews of the present day to the original Jews of the Bible would be a hazardous and absurd undertaking. In the course of Jewish history, there was a constant mingling of races which it is not easy to disentangle. But from about A.D. 1000, at the end of the period of proselytism, that is, the entry of people of other faiths into the Jewish religious community, the religion and laws of the Jews themselves, and the social relations in which they lived maintained an inbreeding which in duration and degree has no parallel in European history. The anthropological characteristics of race originated during this period, which in the course of more than 800 years produced a new type of human being, namely the Jew. But what is to be gained, even by proving the existence of Jewish racial characteristics, is quite another matter. The special characteristics of the Jews against which the anti-Semites pretend they are fighting are not in any way the product of race, but of the social conditions in which they live. The fact that they are a caste whose conditions of existence are prescribed by the world around them. When these imposed conditions no longer exist, then the characteristics disappear immediately, that is to say, at least in the second generation which has not had to live in these conditions. But such theoretical discussions take us a long way from the actual practice of National Socialism. In this sphere, everything is much simpler and more straightforward. There is not a single question in which National Socialism has acted in accordance with its own arguments. On the contrary, it has always post factum found venal persons to justify its own barbarities as acts of culture. And if in Germany today racial research sets itself up as science, the real purpose is only to provide a new cloak for the bestialities of the existing regime. Race officials. The Frankfurter Zeitung of May 5, 1933 reports, quote, Dortmund, May 4th, TU. The government commissioner of Dortmund has issued instructions for the immediate organization of a race department in Dortmund. The assistant commissioner for health, Dr. Braus, who is to take charge of the department, has made an important statement to the press on the question of racial hygiene. He indicated that medical material relating to the 80,000 schoolchildren in Dortmund, which provided partial material for statistics of race hygiene, was already available. Thus, the department would first deal with the young persons who would constitute the next generation. At the same time, the investigations laid down under the recently published regulations would be undertaken, that is, in connection with the candidates for official positions and the students in the higher schools and universities. Investigation of the whole population would be a task for future years. The early publication of laws for the separation of the race and its division into types was to be anticipated. The essential feature of this legislation would be the prohibition of any intermingling of races in Germany. The population would also have to be divided into families whose offspring would be welcome to the state, and those whose offspring would be regarded as a burden on the nation. The logical consequence would be the demand for the compulsory sterilization of criminals and other antisocial elements. The fact that all the medical associations of Prussia had recently declared in favor of the sterilization of criminals in the interests of the nation as a whole proved that this demand put forward by the National Socialists was already recognized as justified by wide circles of the nation. The fundamental aim of the organization of racial hygiene could only be reached after some generations, but a government which was conscious of its responsibility was obliged to think in terms of generations." End of quote. Dr. Achim Gerke, a pushing young man, got himself appointed ministerial advisor and expert for racial research at the Ministry of the Interior. Men and submen. All of this seems relatively harmless. It is primarily directed to bring about the economic destruction of the Jewish population, but not to threaten life and limb. The following leaflet is not so harmless. It was distributed in thousands in all restaurants, and in particular was given to every German girl who was seen in company with a Jew. This document threatens every girl who is suspected of the terrible crime of being friendly with a Jew, that her face will be branded with the initials J.H., Judenhor, Jewish prostitute. The assurance is given that this is no mere empty threat, but that in any circumstances it will be carried out if the girl is seen again in company with a Jew. In this we have a clearer example of the National Socialist distinction between men and submen being everyone who does not think and feel as the National Socialists do. The National Socialists divide the men and the submen into different groups. In Group 1 are the pure representatives of the Nordic race. In Group 2, according to Ziel und Weg, the journal of the National Socialist doctors, are, along with, quote, inebriates, drug takers, habitual criminals, and prostitutes, all persons of foreign race, particularly Jews. End of quote. The National Socialist race theoretician, Professor Stammler, proposed on behalf of the National Socialist doctors the following law for the division of the race. Quote, 1. Every person who is of foreign racial blood to the extent of 1/2, that is, one of whose parents or two of whose grandparents were of foreign race, irrespective of their religion, is regarded as of foreign race. Foreign race means all colored races, near Asiatic and Oriental races, including the Jew. 2. In conformity with this, every adult German citizen must declare on oath at the registration office for his area to what race he belongs. In the case of persons under age, the declaration must be made by their legal representatives. False declarations will be punished with imprisonment and confiscation of property. 3. Persons ascertained to be of foreign race must in future describe themselves not as Germans, but as of foreign race, Jews from Germany, etc. 4. Persons born after the Day of Grace are to rank as Germans only when both parents are German. Younger brothers or sisters, however, rank as of the same nationality as their elder brothers or sisters whose nationality has been established by declaration." End of quote. Breeding farms. Professor Stammler, whose name has already been mentioned, writes that, quote, "The aim of breeding is a physically, morally, and mentally sound person of Nordic race." End of quote. To help towards the achievement of this aim, breeding farms are to be provided. The outpourings of a certain Professor Ernst Bergmann indicate what kind of breeding farms they have in mind. Quote, "There are quite enough willing and industrious men and youths to provide mates for the available women and girls, and fortunately, one lively lad suffices for 10 to 20 girls who have not yet killed their desire for a child, were it not for the civilized nonsense, so contrary to nature, of monogamous and permanent marriage." End of quote. Professor Ernst Bergmann in Erkenntnisgeist und Muttergeist. We conclude these examples with yet another Bill for the Preservation of Race Purity, which contains the following. Quote, 1. Marriages between Germans and persons of foreign races are prohibited. Those which have already been contracted remain valid, but new marriages must not be entered into and will not be recognized. 2. Extramatrimonial sexual intercourse between Germans and persons of foreign race will be punished with penal servitude for the person of foreign race and imprisonment for the German party. Prostitutes do not come under this law. 3. The entry into Germany of persons of foreign race is only allowed in special circumstances. The settlement in Germany of persons of foreign race is prohibited. 4. Changes of name, which in most cases are for the sole purpose of concealing the race of the person concerned, are prohibited until further notice. Changes of name made since 1914 are cancelled. End of quote. It may be objected that this kind of nonsense has no real connection with the mass movement, that these race hygienists are only on the edge of the movement, which cannot be regarded as responsible for them. This suggestion is not well founded. A man like Professor Stammler is the official advisor on these questions. The bills drafted by him were introduced by the National Socialist fraction in the Reichstag. They are therefore typical and must be taken seriously as agitation material. Liquidation of the Jewish question. We have given a small number of examples out of the massive incidents in the war of extermination which is being waged against 600,000 German Jews. These documents and facts are typical of the artificially nurtured hatred of the Jews, who have once more in Europe's history been given the role of scapegoats. We have tried to show that in general this fanaticism is not directed against those who were first made the object of hatred, the big bankers, merchants, and speculators. The wrath of the people has once more been turned aside against the lesser fry, against the Jewish middle class and the Jewish working class. Forced denials. What action did the Jews in Germany take? They protested against the foreign atrocity propaganda. Under the pressure of the stormtroopers, they sent out into the world documents which were the product of mortal fear. Often their fear has made them go further than is necessary. No one can blame them. Not every man is a born hero. And eventually an enterprising man got the idea of publishing these denials which had been forced from the Jews in book form under the title The Atrocity Propaganda. The government-controlled Berliner Tageblatt devotes 2 columns to this extremely welcome book, but no one in the world will let himself be led to believe that it was not written by men in fear of their lives and their liberty, and that they were not compelled against their better knowledge to spread the lie that there is no persecution of Jews in Germany. Jews who support Hitler. There are even Jews who support Hitler. In the Jewish press, Wien, Bratislava of March 31st, the organ of the Orthodox Jews, a rabbi, Professor Dr. Weinberg, writes as follows, quote, "In Jewish circles generally, and particularly in Orthodox circles, there is more sympathy and understanding for the national revival in Germany than the leaders of this movement realize. The religious Jews know how particularly grateful they must be to Hitler for his energetic and thoroughgoing fight against communism." End of quote. The central organ of German Zionists, the Jüdische Rundschau, adopts the same attitude. Quote, "Jewish history will understand even Hitler. It will cite him as evidence of the fact that history is made up of the imponderables of human endeavor towards an ideal, no matter what this may be. End of quote. We have already quoted the statement made by the third partner in the alliance with Jewish orthodoxy and Jewish nationalism, Jewish capitalism, the statement made by Oskar Wassermann, director of the Deutsche Bank und Diskontogesellschaft, that he has not suffered the least inconvenience and that he has hardly been able to notice the change in things. Lenin on anti-Semitism. We have not hushed up these statements. On the contrary, they seem to us convincing proof that in the last analysis, the Jewish question, too, is not a question of race, but a class question. The similar experience in Russia under the Tsardom is summarized by Lenin as follows. Quote, "The propagation of hostility against the Jews is described as anti-Semitism. When the accursed Tsarist monarchy was at its last gasp, it tried to incite the ignorant workers and peasants against the Jews. The Tsar's police, in league with the landlords and the capitalists, organized pogroms. They tried to deflect the hatred of the workers and peasants, crushed down by want, from the landlords and exploiters and turn it against the Jews. It has often been the same in other countries too. The capitalists have roused up hostility against the Jews in order to throw dust in the eyes of the workers and distract them from the real enemy of the toiling peoples, capital. It is not the Jews who are the enemy of the toiling people. The enemies of the workers are the capitalists of every country. There are workers, toilers among the Jews. These form the majority. They are our brothers, our comrades in the fight for socialism, because they are oppressed by capital. There are kulaks, exploiters, capitalists among the Jews, as among all other peoples. The capitalists strive to arouse hostility between the workers of different religious beliefs, of different nations and races. The rich Jews, like the rich Russians and the rich people of all countries, all in league with each other, trample on, oppress, and contaminate the workers. Shame and contempt upon the accursed Tsarism which tortured and persecuted the Jews. Shame and contempt upon those who sow hostility against the Jews and hatred against other nations." End of quote. End of Chapter 8. Recorded by Colleen McMahon.
Chapter 9, Part 1 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 9. The Concentration Camps. Part 1. On the basis of statements published in the press, the total number of political prisoners in Hitler's Germany at the beginning of June 1933 must be put at about 60 to 70,000. Of this total, between 35 and 40,000 men and women have been taken to concentration camps. It goes without saying that there is no legal justification for the establishment of concentration camps. There are no laws or regulations determining the rights of prisoners in concentration camps, nor is there any law or regulation governing the length of their detention in the camps. Till our leader takes pity on them. The Neue Zürcher Zeitung, in an article on the concentration camps in Germany published on May 8, 1933, states that the prisoners will be divided into two groups, those whom it is easy and those whom it is difficult to train as citizens, and that the former will be kept in the camps 1 year, the latter 3 years. But this is merely the personal opinion of the reporter, not an official statement. Banishment to the concentration camps, and also the length of the period of detention, are entirely determined by the arbitrary will of the fascist chiefs, central and local. Lieutenant Kaufmann, one of the Nazi controllers of the concentration camp at Heuberg in Baden, put the position very clearly in an interview which he gave at the end of April to a reporter of the Danish paper Politiken. In reply to the question, how long will you keep the prisoners here?" The lieutenant replied, quote, "Till our leader takes pity on them." End quote. The Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung of April 30th, 1933, confirms this statement by Lieutenant Kaufmann insofar as it says, quote, "It will be a long while before many of the prisoners get their freedom, for the will of the prisoners is not easy to break." End quote. If I even knew why I am here. The men and women who have been interned in the concentration camps are completely innocent, even within the meaning of the principle of the fascist state. All socialist and communist workers and leaders who, in the government's view, have done anything against the laws of the fascist regime are not put into the concentration camps, but are locked up in prisons and penal settlements and brought before special courts and sentenced. The people who are interned in the concentration camps are only men and women whose political views are regarded by the fascists as suspect, though even the fascist prosecutors cannot find any pretext for a criminal prosecution against them. Most of them were arrested immediately after the burning of the Reichstag and the elections on March 5th, so that they could not conceivably have carried on any activity hostile to the fascist regime. Towards the end of April, the Politiken published some letters from prisoners in concentration camps. One young worker writes, "If I only knew why I am here." A doctor writes, "Only anonymous and personal revenge can be the reason for my imprisonment." Another man writes, "I have nothing to reproach myself with. I have no idea why I was arrested." The trivial things which suffice to bring people into the concentration camps are well illustrated by the case of the Jewish religious teacher Karl Krebs, who is a citizen of Czechoslovakia and has been in Germany since he was a year old. The following order was issued for his arrest. Quote, "The Jewish teacher of religion, Karl Krebs, of Dinkelsbühl, a Czechoslovakian subject, is to be arrested. On March 29, 1933, Krebs killed some hens, creating great dissatisfaction among the population. Although this was not a criminal act, in view of the great excitement among the population in connection with the atrocity campaign of the Jews abroad, Krebs should not have carried out such an act. The excitement among the population is so great that Krebs must be put under arrest in order to protect him from attacks. The order for his protective arrest is issued in agreement with the Commissioner Burgomaster Ittemeyer in Wassertrudingen. Dinkelsbühl, March 29, 1933. End quote. Krebs is still in prison. What the concentration camps are for. Captain Buck, Nazi chief of the Heuberg concentration camp, told the reporter of the Politiken that the purpose of the concentration camps was, quote, "to punish the prisoners." End quote. In some of the camps, as prisoners who have been released report, the prisoners have to register as convict X. In accordance with the regulations for penal settlements, their heads have even been shaved. The London Daily Telegraph of April 27, 1933, confirms this in a cable from its Vienna correspondent R.G. Gedde. The convicts have not seen a judge and will not see one. The National Socialist leaders have repeatedly stated that internment in the concentration camps is a purely administrative measure, that it is a question of protective detention. The Nazis told the Politiken correspondent, quote, "We have had to intern many of these individuals in order to protect them from the vengeance of the people. They would have been lynched by the patriotic mob, who regard these criminals as the instigators of the November Revolution." End quote. This statement is an outright lie. The extraordinarily strict watch on the camps is not for the sake of protecting the interned socialists and communists. The machine guns in front of the camps are to make any attempts at flight or rescue impossible. Wherever there have been so-called demonstrations against arrested persons, the tumult and rioting has been organized by the fascists. The transfer of the former Social Democratic minister Romelli to a concentration camp, which was organized as a great popular entertainment, shows this clearly. The Völkischer Beobachter of May 17, 1933, published the following report, headed "In the Pillory." Quote, "On Tuesday, the former state president and minister, Dr. Adam Romelli, recently president of the German Consumers Purchasing Cooperative Society in Hamburg, who a few days ago was brought from there to Karlsruhe at the request of the government, was taken in an open police car from the prison at the western end of the town to the office of the chief of police. With Romelli were also Stenz, whom he had placed in the Ministry of the Interior, the former Baden councillor and member of the Reichstag, Marum, the editor of the Karlsruhe Social Democratic paper Volksfreund, Grunenbaum, the former police commissioner, Führer and the Baden leaders of the Reichsbanner and the Iron Front, as well as other members of the Social Democratic Party. From the police headquarters, they were then taken to a penal settlement at Kieslau, now a concentration camp. A gigantic crowd had assembled outside the prison and greeted the prisoners with jeers and catcalls. A double row of Nazi protective corpsmen marched with linked arms in front of the first police car, on which the prisoners were seated bareheaded, to clear the street. A second police car followed the first, filled with stormtroopers. The procession was also flanked by stormtroopers, and others brought up the rear. The police cars drove quite slowly through a double wall of onlookers, often 8 deep. Catcalls and abuse greeted the prisoners all the way along the streets. The song of the miller was also sung everywhere, by way of mocking Romelli, who had once been a miller's laborer and had forbidden the singing of this song in Baden. The procession passed in front of the Diet buildings and the government offices, as well as the former trade union building, at each of which a short halt was made. Along the way, bands also played the song of the miller. The concourse was so immense that the whole of the tramway and motor traffic was stopped. A number of persons who shouted "Red Front" were arrested on the spot and taken along in the second police car. End quote. The report shows clearly that this was an organized demonstration with carefully prepared shouting. In short, that it was one of those spectacles which the Reich Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels, uses to entertain the crowd and to make it for a while forget its hunger. Protective arrest. Protective detention in Germany is strictly governed by the law of 1849 on the restriction of personal freedom. By this law, only persons who are themselves threatened may be taken into protective arrest. This must not be continued longer than is necessary for the purpose, and in no case longer than 3 months. The law provides for the lodging of appeals and a decision by the courts. But all those who are now imprisoned were arrested not in their own interest, but to protect the new rulers. They are being kept longer than 3 months, and they have no right to appeal. 45 concentration camps. How many concentration camps are there, and how many people are detained in them? The German government, probably with good reason, avoids giving any exact information. on the basis of a few reports in the German press, occasional statements by Nazi leaders, and visits of foreign journalists, it is possible to draw the conclusion that early in July 1933 there were 45 concentration camps with between 35,000 and 40,000 prisoners. The following are some of the camps: Dachau, near Munich, Bavaria, 5,000 prisoners. Heuberg, Upper Baden, 2,000 prisoners. Kieslau, near Buchsal, Baden, 100 prisoners. Rastatt, Baden, 300 prisoners. Bad Dürkheim, Baden, 500 prisoners. Pfalz, 2,000 prisoners. Mülheim, Rhine, 2,000 prisoners. Hohenstein, Saxony, 800 prisoners. Ortenstein, Zwickau, Saxony, 200 prisoners. Zittau, Saxony, 300 prisoners. Ohrdruf, Thuringia, 1,200 prisoners. Oranienburg, near Berlin, 1,500 prisoners. Sonnenburg, Prussia, 414 prisoners. Sennelager, Paderborn, 900 men, 30 women. Esterwagen, Westphalia, 500 prisoners. Wilsede, Lünenberger Heide, 2,000 prisoners. Königstein, Saxony, 200 prisoners. A concentration camp at Papenburg, Emsland, has been equipped for 4,000 prisoners. Other camps are at Ginsheim and Rodelheim, near Frankfurt, Langen and Osthofen in Hessen, Kassel, Fuhlsbüttel and Wittmoor near Hamburg, Bremen, Braunschweig, Gründahl near Königsberg, and another in East Prussia, Schleswig, Pomerania, Breslau. There are 6 camps in Brandenburg province, 5 in the Ruhr area, and a number in central Germany. The number of prisoners in these camps is not known. In the middle of May, the government decided to open 10 new concentration camps. The Frankfurter Zeitung of May 30th, 1933, reports that a second concentration camp will be opened at Heuberg for such prisoners as are not to be released before the winter. Women and intellectuals in the camps. There are hundreds of women among the prisoners in the concentration camps. The communist women members of the Reichstag and of the state diets, insofar as they were found, were first taken to the women's prison in the Barnumstrasse in Berlin, before they were taken to the concentration camp. This prison has been organized as a collecting and transit station for arrested women. Early in June, a special concentration camp for women was organized in South Germany. An official announcement dated June 8, 1933, states, quote, "A detention camp for women has been organized at Gotzel, near Gmund in Württemberg." End quote. A second concentration camp for women was opened in Saxony a few days later. All reports agree that the women in the prisons and concentration camps are being subjected to exceptionally bad treatment and persecution. All kinds of views and professions and ages are represented among the prisoners in the concentration camps. Communists, anarchists, social democrats, adherents of the Center Party, pacifists, Jews, young and old people, workers, intellectuals, artists, students, members of parliamentary bodies, lawyers, doctors, writers, tradesmen, well-known names and unknown names. Martin Buber, the gray-haired Zionist poet, Karl von Ossietzky, the revolutionary pacifist editor of the Weltbühne, the anarchist Erich Mühsam, the Bavarian member of parliament, Auer, the democratic member of the Reichstag, Fischer, the Social Democrat members of the Reichstag, Rossmann and Pfluger, the barrister Hans Litten, the doctors Schminke and Bernheim, and many others of similar standing. The truth breaks through. The Hitler government has done its best to conceal the conditions in the concentration camps. The Committee for the Victims of Fascism has nevertheless succeeded in obtaining from prisoners who have succeeded in getting away, and from relatives of prisoners, a considerable amount of material which throws light on the terrible condition of the prisoners in the concentration camps. In spite of the Nazi guards and barbed wire, the truth has broken through to the outside world. Foreign journalists have been allowed to see some of the model camps, such as those at Heuberg, Dachau, and Oranienburg. Nazi stormtroopers accompanied the press representatives everywhere. There was no opportunity of separate conversation with any of the prisoners. The descriptions given by these correspondents are therefore general impressions of the arrangement of the camps rather than observations of actual conditions. But where the journalists were able, even though in a very restricted way, to describe the objective conditions, or where, as in the case of Edmund Taylor of the Chicago Daily Tribune, they were able to put a few questions to prisoners in a foreign language, the truth also comes to light in the newspaper reports. Anyone who wants to help get the truth about the German concentration camps must support the demand for an international commission of members of all the relief committees to have the right to visit every camp, not under the control of the commandants of the camps and of Nazi guards, but to make their visits without warning, with the right to investigate conditions in every detail and to talk to every prisoner without interference. The convict prisons of Sonnenburg and Fuhlsbüttel were closed down some years ago because they were buildings belonging to the Middle Ages and were absolutely unhygienic from a modern standpoint. Even habitual criminals were no longer sent there. In Fuhlsbüttel, there are no closets and no drains. Detention in this prison is acute torture, particularly in the hot part of the year. But these are the prisons which the Hitler government has now established as concentration camps. Among the prisoners at Sonnenburg are Litten, Kasper, Ossietzky, and Mühlsam. The concentration camp at Zittau was formerly a bookshop, so that the comforts of this camp can be imagined. The concentration camp at Dachau, according to a report in the Daily Telegraph of April 25, 1933, consists of old half-decayed huts. Oranienburg is the model camp which has been shown to a number of foreign journalists and of which the Nazis have broadcast photographs. An abandoned factory, formerly a brewery. The works have fallen into ruin. The windows are simply broken glass. The yard is covered with grass and weeds. This is how the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung of April 30, 1933, describes Oranienburg. We are in possession of a confidential report from a German woman journalist who accompanied a foreign correspondent as interpreter when he visited the camp at Oranienburg. Quote, "Only one single pump in the courtyard. The prisoners, of whom there are between 100 and 200, have to wash in 5 old wash basins which stand in the courtyard. The rooms where they sleep are old workshops which are in ruins. A few inches of dirty straw cover the cement floor." End quote. The Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung of April 30, 1933, confirms that the prisoners have to sleep on straw. In Dachau, according to the description given by Gide, In the Daily Telegraph of April 25, 1933, 54 prisoners sleep in a small hut on rough wooden boards covered with straw. The interpreter who has already been mentioned describes the appalling conditions in such a dormitory at Oranienburg. Quote, "Already by evening, when the prisoners are locked in, the place stinks as if a herd of wild animals had spent the night there. But it is impossible to describe the air after it has been slept in by 50 or more men whose clothes are unwashed and whose sweating bodies fill the room with vapor." End quote. The model camp at Heuberg. The concentration camp at Heuberg is the showplace among the camps. It is exhibited to all foreign reporters, who for the most part describe the external appearance of the camp and its environment, but do not deal with the internal rooms and dormitories. At the end of May, the Frankfurter Zeitung published a detailed report on a visit to the Heuberg camp, which testifies to the extremely close guard kept on the prisoners and the military drill imposed on them. The young Nazis are forbidden to enter into conversation with prisoners, owing to the fear that they might be influenced politically. The report runs, quote, "The old parade ground is now used as a concentration camp. Going in through a lattice fence, we could see the whole camp spread out before us. First there are the offices, a post office and the officials' quarters, with little gardens. Then left and right the former quarters of the Reichswehr soldiers. Here, at a height of 2,700 feet, where there is little green to be seen, 2,000 prisoners are herded together in small rooms. The houses are shut in by iron railings. Tall barbed wire fences run round the buildings in a double line, so that there is a space between them. The concentration camp is divided into sections. The storm troopers are on guard, with rifles, by the iron railings. Both sides of the barbed wire fences are guarded by auxiliary police. The windows are empty. It is forbidden to look out. At night, searchlights play on the sides of the building. Each building is divided into two sections, A and B. There is one latrine between them in the courtyard. Left and right of the staircase on each floor are large rooms, and between them the former sergeant major's room, now labeled control officers. There are 3 of these, one storm troop officer for each of the large rooms, and a police sergeant who maintains contact with the police officer in charge. At the entrance to the prisoner's room there is a register containing the names of the 36 prisoners. Name, place of birth, address. The storm troop officer pulls out his key. We hear "Look out!" shouted inside, and the voices in the room are silent. Chairs are pushed back. The prisoners rise to their feet when the control officer enters. The prisoners sit on little stools at long smooth tables, playing chess. They have made the pieces themselves. There are practically no papers or books to be seen. Each room is provided with one newspaper, which is usually read aloud by someone. There are small square cupboards along the wall, in which eating utensils are kept. While the young Nazi auxiliary police, all of whom come from the countryside, are forbidden to have any dealings with the prisoners, the Nazi officers are charged with the duty of bringing their political influence to bear on the prisoners in the room under their control. Correspondence is controlled by the officials. Each prisoner can write a letter or card once a fortnight. The officer in charge has to determine from these letters the general conduct of the prisoners and official and private conversations with them, which of the prisoners show any prospect of changing their political views. End quote. We can supplement this report with information given us in a letter from the Heuberg camp. The writer's name cannot be disclosed for the reason that he is still in the camp. Quote, "There are 2,000 comrades in Heuberg, most of them communists. They are kept in 7 or 8 two-story buildings. Each double block and single block are separated off by barbed wire fences 2 meters high. In rooms 12 meters by 8, 30 men are housed. In the top rooms, 4 to 12 men according to the size of the rooms. The beds, in 2 tiers, consist of a straw sack and 2 blankets. There are no baths." The reporter of De Telegraaf, the Amsterdam paper, says in a report of April 5th that the prisoners get a bath once a month. Evidently, this does not apply to all prisoners. The editors. Soap is not provided. Anyone who wants it must buy it. Linen is not provided, and there is no washing. Towels are in short supply, one between 2 prisoners. Open razors are forbidden. Shaving is difficult, so beards are becoming the latest achievement of the German awakening." End quote. Captain Buck, who is in control of the camp, told the Politiken reporter that Heuberg is not a sanatorium, either in comfort or in hygiene. He is right. These camps are breeding grounds of disease, and but few will leave them sound. The guards round the camp. The prisoners in the camps are kept under extraordinarily strict control. Nazi stormtroopers are patrolling everywhere, armed with rubber truncheons, rifles, and revolvers. Many of the patrols are accompanied by police dogs. The official photographs show this. It is confirmed by the Politiken, the Telegraph, and the Daily Telegraph, and by every prisoner's letters. In the Daily Telegraph of April 27, 1933, Gedde reports that the concentration camp at Dachau is surrounded by a high wire fence, which is charged with high-voltage electricity. Machine guns are kept ready at the main posts. The correspondents of the Telegraph and Politiken were struck by the mass of barbed wire and railings from which escape was impossible. At night, the camp is lighted up by gigantic searchlights. The light prevents the prisoners from sleeping. The Telegraph of April 5, 1933 says, quote, "If anyone opens a window to get a breath of air, he is shot at." End quote. The camp at Oranienburg has low factory walls on one side, and on the other, where the prisoners take exercise, quite low shrubbery. Do none of the prisoners try to get away? The journalist who visited the camp with a foreign correspondent put this question. The reply, quote, "There is no danger of flight here. The guards are armed and have strict instructions to shoot at once if any of the prisoners cross the boundary marked by the bushes. Besides, why should they try to get away? Things are all right for them here. Even when they are allowed to go, they don't want to." End quote. The questioner, quote, "But that is impossible." Unquote. The reply, quote, "The day before yesterday we received instructions to set one man free. He would not go and had to be taken to the station by force. Ask the others whether this is so or not." End quote. The journalist continues her report. Quote, "It is a fact that there have been cases of prisoners not wanting their liberty. But why? The orders for release come as a rule at night or at a very early hour of the morning. At that time it is easier to shoot a prisoner on the way. And then the following day the papers report Marxist shot when trying to escape." End quote. In fact, these low bushes are meant to tempt prisoners to flight, but flight means death. Grouping of prisoners. The arbitrary decisions which have brought the concentration camps into being have also divided the prisoners into 3 categories: A. Easily reformable, German nationals, Bavarian guards, and political followers. B. Not easily reformable. C. Unreformable. Communist leaders and officials and intellectuals of left views are put in the last category, and the worst treatment is meted out to them. In the report on the Heuberg camp, which has already been quoted, this fact is confirmed. Quote, prisoners who, on the basis of documents and reports, are classified as unreformable are put into the old building, numbers 19 and 23. There everything is much stricter. The controlling officer does not have any conversation with them. The time allowed for exercise is restricted to 10 minutes. Permission to smoke and talk is given less frequently, and they are not allowed to work, which, with the other prisoners, gives the opportunity for a few hours of physical activity and entitles them to extra food. End quote. The commandants of the camps compete with each other in inventing more and more ingenious punishments. Prisoners have their free time shortened. Permission to write letters is granted less often or taken away altogether. They are not permitted to have visitors for a long period. They are forbidden to take part in the general conversation during their free time. They are isolated and particularly sharply controlled. They are forbidden to smoke. They are given long periods of arrest with only 10 minutes exercise, or are confined in a dark room. Disciplinary punishments which are frequently used are additional exercise, continued for several hours, drilling, longer work hours, and particularly unaccustomed and irritating work. In some of the concentration camps, prisoners against whom the Nazis have a particular grudge have even been kept in chains. According to the Daily Telegraph report of April 27, 1933, refractory prisoners, for example at Dachau, are not allowed out of the tiny huts and may not go into the open air. The report of the woman journalist already referred to describes a cell in the Oranienburg camp in which, quote, not easily reformable, unquote, prisoners are kept. Quote, a hole in the wall, shut in by an iron door, and without any other ventilation but the door. We were shown one of these rooms empty, but this was an hour after we had begun to inspect the camp, so that evidently the prisoners had first been taken out. Then of the 120 prisoners in the camp, 30 were missing. Were they perhaps behind that iron door, which we were not allowed to examine more closely? End quote. At Heuberg, an elderly lawyer complained of the bad food. For making this complaint, he was condemned to sleep 15 nights on the roof of the barracks without any shelter. Captain Buck, however, assured the Telegraph reporter, April 5, 1933, that there were no detention cells in the Heuberg camp. Manhandled and beaten. All reports are unanimous on the fact that the unimprovable prisoners are being treated in such a way that their physical ruin is inevitable. The aim is the physical extermination of the organizers of the German working class. Captain Buck assured the representative of the Politiken that no one was mishandled in the concentration camps. Quote, no blows, no punishments, end quote, he asserted. But the government's press itself indicates that this is not true. The Angriff of April 1st writes, quote, a Reichsbanner man was interrogated. He gave an insolent reply. However, a friendly but pointed look at his own rubber truncheon sufficed to bring home to him the seriousness of the position. End quote. The maltreatment that must go on in this camp if a glance at a rubber truncheon is enough to bring home to a prisoner the seriousness of the position is confirmed by the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung of April 30th, 1933. Quote, for it was only by laying hold of them and carrying through the interrogation with merciless severity that we have succeeded in discovering the underground terror almost to its full extent, but the resistance of individual prisoners has still to be broken." This report confirms that torture is used in the interrogations. We have a report of the correspondent of the Chicago Daily Tribune, Edmund Taylor. He managed to speak in English and French with some of the prisoners in the Heuberg camp, so that the stormtroopers accompanying him did not know what was said. Many of the prisoners expressly stated that in that camp severe mishandling was a frequent occurrence. Similar reports come from the Schloss Ortenstein camp near Zwickau. Visitors to this camp have declared on oath that they saw bleeding wheals and green and blue patches on the arms and hands of prisoners. There can be no doubt whatever that these are the result of maltreatment. The mishandling was particularly severe when the stormtroopers were in charge of the prisoners. When they were replaced by police, the position became more bearable, but the stormtroopers have been put into the Ortenstein camp again since the beginning of May. End of Chapter 9, Part 1.